It is so good to see all of you here today. Those of you that are here in person and those of you who are watching online, thank you so much for joining us. Many of you know that April of this year, I finally was able to do the 50K one-day hike that I had been training for since 2019. It had been canceled for several years due to COVID. And then in January, I had surgery for my colon cancer, and so I didn't have much time to train for the April hike, but I wasn't going to let anything stop me. And so I trained as much as I could, and I went and I started hiking. It was a beautiful day. You can see a big smile on my face. This was before the race started. I had some great conversations with people along the way, and there were support stations throughout the hike to help us stay hydrated and fueled up. But something happened around mile 24. My muscles cramped up like they had never cramped up before. I couldn't walk very fast. I was going less than 3 miles per hour, just struggling to make it. I still had 7 miles to go. Now, thankfully, I found another slow hiker. His name was Carl. Crawling Carl is what I ended up calling him. I was thankful for Crawling Carl, and we encouraged each other to keep going. And at about mile 26, something unexpected happened. A huge tree had fallen and blocked the path, and we weren't sure how we were going to get past it. Now, as you can see, it wasn't that big of a tree. But when you're tired, and when you're hungry, and your muscles are cramped up, and you haven't trained as much as you could, even the most basic obstacle can seem overwhelming. And so I decided that I was going to go over it. Carl decided he was going to try to crawl under it over at the end. And normally I would be able to just kind of lift my leg up and catapult over it, but I could not lift my leg up. And so what did I do? I just kind of plopped down onto the log and then just rolled over as much as I could and just plop, landed on the ground. And in that moment, I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to get up. Honestly, I wasn't sure that I wanted to get up, but somehow, some way, I mustered up enough energy, and I got up, and I kind of hobbled over to Carl. Carl had tried to crawl underneath, and he had got stuck. He wasn't able to get up, and so I helped him up, and we kind of crawled and hobbled the rest of the way. And we made it. Our tanks were low. We needed fuel. And we've all felt that way at one point or another, whether you've done a 50K or you're just trying to get through your week. When we go through life and we work hard and we do everything we can to have success, and we're trying to find joy and satisfaction and fulfillment and wholeness everywhere and anywhere we can, and we're just tired and our tanks are running low, and we begin to feel overwhelmed, and the most basic obstacle can make us feel like, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make it. How did I get here? We're exhausted and depressed and anxious and stressed and living without much joy, just hoping to make it the next mile, just hoping to make it through the next day and the next week and the next month. And so that's why we've been in a summer series called Reset. It's all about the soul. And we've been looking at the 6 basic aspects of who we are as human beings. We all have thoughts and feelings and a will that allows us to make choices, both good choices and bad choices, choices that heal and fulfill our soul, and choices that can damage and diminish our soul and our connection to God and others. And we have a social context in which we're able to connect with others and to be able to encourage them or actually discourage them possibly as well. But the soul is the part of us that integrates all those other parts and makes us who we are. We spent the last few months taking a few weeks for each of these basic aspects of what it means to be human. And if you've missed any of the earlier messages, I want to encourage you to go to our website or our YouTube page, and you can catch up on any of the messages in this series up to this point so that you can better understand what we've been discussing. Last week, Pastor Ted did a great job of talking about our physical bodies, and he showed us in 1 Corinthians that the body is for God and God is for the body. He also mentioned at the end of his message something we've been talking a lot about here at C3, how our bodies need to be trained, and how They are automatically trained to make good decisions or bad decisions. They're automatically trained by our habits and how we need to intentionally make choices with our will that will help us to take care of our physical bodies so that we can have a well-ordered soul, a well-ordered life. And today we're going to talk about making those choices that will fuel our bodies and feed our souls. In fact, that's the big idea of today's message. Fuel your body and feed your soul. There's a story in the Old Testament that I never really connected with fueling our physical bodies until I heard a friend of mine preach it a few years ago. And it stuck with me this whole time, and I wasn't sure I would ever be able to share it with you until we got into the series. I thought that it connected well. And so I want to unpack our big idea today by looking at a story in the Old Testament about a man named Elijah. Elijah was a man of great faith. He did incredible things for God, but the event that he was most famous for is what he did on Mount Carmel, where he challenged his enemies to a battle. Elijah was outnumbered 850 to 1. And so on one side there was Elijah, on the other side there was 850 prophets of Baal. And so he challenged them to build an altar to their gods, and he would then build an altar to the one true God. And he made a deal with them, and he said, hey, if fire falls from heaven and lights your altar, I'll go ahead and worship your gods. But if fire comes down from heaven and lights my altar, you have to worship my God. And in 1 Kings 18, we see that God indeed sent fire from heaven to Elijah's altar, and all the people started worshiping God. And after we read this story, we see that the nation of Israel is going to turn their heart back to God. Even King Ahab, whose heart was so cold towards God, was turning his heart towards God. Everything seems to be going well when suddenly things begin to change. King Ahab's wife, the infamous Jezebel, hated God and hated Elijah by default because Elijah loved and preached about the one true God. And so Jezebel sends Elijah a letter basically saying, I'm going to kill you. You got 24 hours to live. Now, up to this point, we see Elijah being a man of great faith. Nothing can knock him off course. He listens to God. He gets his directions from God, and he does what God tells him to do. But this letter shakes him to the core of who he is. And it makes sense that he would be shaken for a few reasons. One, Jezebel had a track record of killing people who worshiped and preached about the one true God. And so this was a legit threat. But secondly, Elijah was just tired. He was worn out. He was exhausted. His tank was low. Have you ever been to that place where you're just tired, spiritually, mentally, socially, emotionally? The whole of who you are is just exhausted. And then somebody says something on your Facebook post. It's then somebody sends you a text message, or you receive a letter, or you see a post by somebody that you love and you respect, and you disagree with it so vehemently. And maybe you get an unexpected bill. You see something on the news that just doesn't sit right with you, and it might not even be that big of a deal, but because you're so tired and you're so exhausted and you're so worn out, it's all you can think about. It keeps you up at night. You ruminate on it over and over again for days and for weeks. And you know that it shouldn't be that big of a deal, but you just can't help but think about it. It becomes all consuming. And that's what Elijah seems to be experiencing in this moment. And so what does he do? He runs for his life. And it wasn't normal for Elijah to run. Normally, he would listen to God and go wherever God directed him to go. And there's no sign that God told him to run, but he runs anyways, and he runs far. He runs about 100 miles. That's about from here, for those of you who are watching in Wheeling, from Wheeling to Parkersburg, West Virginia. And so that would have taken him several days. And by the time he gets to Beersheba, he is worn out. He's tired. He's exhausted. He's scared. And so he does the only logical thing to do. He asks God to let him die in his sleep. He'd been running for his life, but now he's so exhausted and so tired, he doesn't want to run for his life anymore. He's done. He wants to die. He's not motivated. He has no desire to wake up and to continue to live this life that he's been living. And if you've ever been discouraged or depressed or burnt out or exhausted, you know exactly how Elijah felt. You know, there's moments when you pray, God, would you take my life? And there's other moments when you feel like, okay, you know what, I'm okay. Like we can do this. And so you have your good days and you have your bad days, but some of you are here today and some of you are watching online today and you're thinking, God, I'm done. I'm just done. I've had enough suffering. I've gone to enough funerals. I've had enough troubles with my house. I'm tired of not having enough money at the end of the month. I've had enough disappointment, enough backstabbing, enough failure. I'm sick and tired of the political polarization and all the division. I'm sick of taking 2 steps backward for every step forward. God, I'm done. And I know that some of you have had those thoughts because you've shared that with me. And I know that I've had some of those thoughts as well over these last few years. And it seems like there's this sense of stress and anxiety and exhaustion that just seems to be filling up not only our churches, but our country as a whole. And so at this point, Elijah's tank was empty. And so he does the only thing that he knows to do. He goes to bed and he asks God, please, God, help me not to wake up. And that's when the story takes another unexpected twist. Elijah's sleeping, hoping that he doesn't wake up, and he hears a voice, and he feels something shaking him. And this is weird because he's 100 miles away from home, and he's alone underneath a tree. But Elijah looks up, and there's an angel of God. Not only is it an angel, but the angel is making him breakfast. The angel is making him breakfast. How cool is that? Like if I ever have an encounter with an angel, I hope that he makes me breakfast. I want that kind of angel to wake me up. And so according to 1 Kings 19, the angel made him fresh bread. Fresh bread. And I'm sure it smelled amazing. And I just picture this salty bread from Sarah's on Main Street or from Good Mansion Wine. If you've never had it, it is delicious. It's amazing. And the angel gives him 1 or 2 or 3. And the Bible says that Elijah reaches over for a cup, and the angel gives him a cup of water. And Elijah drinks the water, and then the angel tells him to go back to sleep. Hours later, the angel wakes him up again and tells him, have some more. And this is kind of like if you've ever stayed in the hospital. I had to stay in the hospital in January for 4 nights after my surgery. And you know, the hospitals are the worst place in the world to get a good night's sleep, right? The nurses, God bless, they're just doing their job. They come in like every half hour, right when you're about to go to sleep. They come in and they check your vitals, and they make sure you're taking your medicine, and they make sure you have water, and they make sure that you're eating food if you can eat food. And God bless the nurses, but you cannot get a good night's sleep in the hospital. But God, through the angel, was taking care of Elijah physically, spiritually, mentally. And a few hours later, Elijah was eventually strong enough to make another journey. And so the angel tells him to go down into the wilderness and to go on a 40-day journey. Nowhere in the text does the angel tell him specifically where to go, but where he ends up, it would have only taken him 3 or 4 days to walk if he would have walked straight. But it took him 40 days. The angel told him, take 40 days on this journey, 6 weeks. I can kind of picture that being like somebody seeing that you're worn out and exhausted and saying, you know what, I have a cabin up in the mountains. I have a camp. I have a beach house. Why don't you take some time and go refresh yourself? Get a reset physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Go and rest and relax and connect with your soul. Connect with God. Get healthy. Take your time. And so that's what Elijah does. He goes and he takes a walk out in the wilderness. And I'm sure he was contemplating and praying. He had just seen an angel and was worn out and exhausted after running for 100 miles before that. And so Elijah walks and eats and sleeps. He refuels his body for 40 days. And it's getting to be dark, and he's tired. And he doesn't know where he's at in the wilderness. And so he decides that he's going to slip into this cave that he sees, and he goes to sleep. And the next morning, Elijah hears another voice, Elijah, Elijah. And at first, he thinks it must be the angel again, but then he recognizes, no, that's not the angel's voice. It's the very voice of God. And God asked him, Elijah, what are you doing here? And Elijah yells out, Lord, I've been zealous for you. The Israelites, they've rejected your covenant. They've torn down your altars. They've killed your prophets. Lord, I'm the only one left. Sometimes when we go through hard seasons, we feel like we're the only ones going through those hard seasons. Sometimes when we go through hard seasons, we feel like we're the only ones who are doing it right. Everybody else, they're doing it wrong, but rarely is that the case. And so God's voice echoes again in the cave, stand up, Elijah, stand up and come out of the cave. And in 1 Kings 19, I'd encourage you to read it on your own. It's much longer than this. As Elijah is trying to stand up, God sends a mighty wind, and what does he do? He knocks him on his butt. The wind is so strong that it shakes the cave, and trees are breaking, and rocks are falling. And when the wind stops, you can picture Elijah sheepishly trying to stand back up again. And all of a sudden, God sends an earthquake, and Elijah falls back on his butt again. And the cave is shaking, and the roof is cracking, and Elijah knows that he has to hurry and get out of that cave. And so he finally musters up enough strength, and he comes to the very edge of the cave, and he stands on the rock ledge, and Elijah will never forget what he saw that day. He got a glimpse of God. And we have no idea what that looked like, but I can imagine the most beautiful, mysterious, fast-moving, rainbow-colored cloud, unlike anything he had ever seen before, too beautiful to even put into words. And out of that cloud, the Bible tells us that God spoke to Elijah in a still, small voice. The passage says that God spoke to him in a gentle voice, a tender, compassionate voice. And we don't know what God said to Elijah. And I think that God purposely left that blank so that you and I can hear from the voice of God this morning exactly what each of us needs to hear. And so Elijah, in response, he does the only thing that he knows to do. He falls on his face and he worships God. And now he has new courage. He's been refueled. He's got the courage to leave his hiding place and to focus on conducting the things that God has for him instead of focusing on his fear, instead of focusing on the troubles that he has with Jezebel. And so our story began with Elijah being the strong leader, doing amazing things for God. But even strong leaders are human and can become depleted and in need of fuel. Elijah needed to fuel his body, and he needed to feed his soul. Earlier in the series, I shared a story about running out of gas in my car, and after the sermon, someone said, Adam, how many times have you ran out of gas? Like, that's the third story that we've heard in your sermons. Are you just making these stories up? And I'm like, no, like, I've ran out of gas way more than 3 times. I have like 10 or 12 stories to tell you if I could. Now, the truth is that it's been about 6 or 7 years since I've ran out of gas, because I think that previously I had trust issues with the gauge. You know, when it said that there's only 5 miles left, I'm like, nah, that means 10 or 20 miles, right? Like, we can make it to the next gas station. But running out of gas a dozen times will teach you some lessons, hopefully, right? Hopefully it doesn't take you that long. But I've learned over the years to fuel up when my tank begins to get low. But what about when we begin to run out of gas physically or spiritually or emotionally? Have we learned to fill up our tanks? Some of you are here today and your tank is low and you're not going to trust God enough to slow down and allow him to refuel you. And you're going to pay the consequences. The longer you wait, the greater the cost. Some of us are like Elijah, where we just aren't sure if we can make it another day. And I want to put your mind at ease and let you know that you're not alone. In fact, the Bible is filled with people, great spiritual leaders, men and women. And yes, we might admire their strength, but we resonate with their weaknesses. It's one of the reasons I love the Apostle Paul. He says, I do the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things that I do want to do. This is a process even for the great spiritual leaders. They fail, they make mistakes. They're still in training. They're still in process of becoming more like Jesus, just like we are. And refueling our body is an important part because it really does affect every other part of who we are, including our souls, our ability to love God and to love people well. And so what I want to do today is I want to finish our time by giving you some practical ideas of things that you can do to refuel your physical tank. And almost all of them are found right in our story in 1 Kings. And they're simple, ordinary things because our extraordinary God loves to refuel us in ordinary ways. Sometimes we want it to be this amazing thing where we see a glimpse of God and we hear God's audible voice. And some of us are always seeking those high experiences, and I believe that's misdirected zeal. The majority of the Christian life is spent in quiet, routine, humble, obscure obedience, training in God's will, becoming more and more like Jesus, yes, in our successes, but probably even more so in our failures. How does God refuel us physically? One way that he does is through food. God refuels us with healthy food. Remember the angel of God who met with Elijah and brought him that good-looking bread? It probably wasn't bread from Good Mansion Wine. I'm just guessing. Wild guess. It actually was more of a flat bread, a lot lower carbs than the bread that we showed on the picture today. But it was just food. And Elijah needed to eat. He needed to refuel himself. And so he ate and he went back to sleep. And I'm a pastor. I'm not a dietitian. I'm not a nutritionist. I don't play one on the radio or pretend to be an expert in any way, shape, or form. But it doesn't take an expert. You don't have to be an expert to know that what you eat affects your health. It affects our mind. It affects our mood. It affects how much energy we have to do the things that are most important for us to do. And so just like a Ferrari won't move without gas and it'll be destroyed if you put diesel fuel into it, we all need regular refueling with the right kind of gas if we're going to run well. 1 Corinthians 10:31 tells us, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. And so this verse tells us that there's a way to glorify God, not just with what comes out of our mouths, with prayer and praise throughout the week, and when we're here on Sunday morning singing songs of praise, but by what we put into our mouths as well. And our modern age has made this verse both easier and harder. Easier because we know so much about the science of food and the impact on our bodies and our minds and our moods. It's not for a lack of knowledge that keeps us all from being as healthy as we can be. And harder because there are so many unhealthy, processed, sugar-filled foods and drinks that are way more convenient, more affordable, and that tempt us. And so it's important for us to make good choices, to arrange our days in a way where we can make better, not perfect, but better food choices than perhaps we're currently making. Food that energizes us and fuels us instead of food that causes us to become hangry, as Pastor Ted talked about last week. I know there's certain foods that when I eat, yeah, they taste good and I love the taste, but just an hour or two later, I'm not as likely to be patient or loving or kind. And I can get a little bit moody. And so I have to keep that into account before I make that decision. And so we can refuel with food, but there's also water. In verse 6 and 8, Elijah took a jar of water and drank it. And it's only been the last several years that I've really noticed the impact of whether I'm hydrated or not and how it affects my health and my mood. The basic recommendation has been 8 glasses of water a day, and depending on your size and your activity level, it may be a little less or a lot more for you. And so it's kind of debated on how much you're supposed to drink every day, but one thing we can agree on is that God gave us water to drink for our energy and for our mood and to regulate our body temperature. And science is showing that it helps our sleep quality, and the list goes on and on. The importance of staying hydrated cannot be more clear. And so are you drinking enough water? For me, I try to start my day with a cup or two before I start pouring that cup of coffee. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But I often have carried this around. And I've learned that if I start my day with a glass or two in the morning, and then I carry one of these around, I'm much more likely to actually drink 1 or 2 or 3 of these throughout the course of the day than if I just get busy with my to-do list, working and trying to check off everything that I need to accomplish at the end of the day when I'm having dinner and I realize, wait a second, I haven't had a drink of water since this morning. And so this is one simple way, is to get yourself a water bottle and make sure that you carry it with you as a simple reminder. God also refuels us through exercise. We see that Elijah takes 40 days, again, 6 weeks, to walk through the wilderness. And I don't think that's a mistake. God didn't give him a step counter. He didn't give him a 10,000 step a day goal, but he tells him to walk every day for 40 days, a distance that would have only taken him 3 or 4 days to walk if he would walk straight there. And I believe that not only was God refueling Elijah physically, like, slow down. You don't need to run like you did those 100 miles. You can walk slowly. I want you to refuel physically, but I also want to reconnect you to me, to refuel you spiritually, to encourage you to connect and to be able to spend some time listening to my voice. I think sometimes we think that coming to church or praying or reading the Bible, that's spiritual, but eating healthy and going to the gym, that's not spiritual stuff. That's all about me. Well, as Ted talked about last week, it can be all about me, but when our motivation is to love God and to love people well, then we can make everything we do sacred, including taking care of ourselves. God is interested in the physical for you because it affects your soul and your ability to represent him well to the world around you. And so are you getting enough exercise? Most of us aren't. And it doesn't have to be anything crazy. Usually something is better than nothing. We're all at different seasons and stages in life. And so, the goal might not be to break world records, but perhaps it's just to be healthier tomorrow than I am today. And so don't make being healthy the goal, because that might seem a little bit overwhelming, but being healthier tomorrow than I am today is a more achievable goal. It might be running if you're able to run. It might be going to the gym and doing strength training, which more and more research is showing is greatly beneficial for men and women, especially as we get older, because it helps us to prevent losing our bone density. It might be riding your bike or playing pickleball or joining an amateur volleyball league and playing with friends. And so for me, I like to strength train 2 or 3 times a week, and I use a lot less weight than I used to. I'm not trying to break any world records. I'm not trying to look like The Rock. I think my bald head is the only thing that ever will look like The Rock. I'm just trying to stay healthy because I want to love God and I want to love others well. And I'm also taking a lot of walks. Sometimes my walks are short and sometimes they're long. Sometimes they're fast. Oftentimes they're slow. And over these last few years, these walks have been so good, not only for me physically, but they've allowed me to connect with God and to process my thoughts and my fears and my emotions and to spend some time in prayer. And on these walks, this is the time where even more often than when I'm at church, or even more often when I'm doing my quiet time in the mornings, these are the times where I can hear that small, still voice of God that directs me and redirects me, and I can spend some time in conversation with God. And so I want to encourage you that this summer, I want to encourage you to refuel with healthy food and by staying hydrated and by getting some physical exercise, but also make sure that you're getting enough sleep. In the story, the angel told Elijah to go to sleep. And going to sleep, believe it or not, can be one of the most spiritual things that we do. I used to always pride myself. I would wake up at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m., and for a long season, it was 5 a.m., and I would pride myself. I get more done before most people wake up than what they're going to get done all day. And I would get a ton done between 5 and 7 or 8 a.m., and then I would be tired and grumpy, and I'd be a jerk the rest of the day. And so is getting a lot done in those 3 hours really worth me being in a bad mood and not connecting with my wife or connecting with my kids or being able to connect with you or with those in my community? Well, I don't think so. And so not long ago, I started trying to go to bed just a little bit earlier, 15 minutes or 30 minutes earlier, and waking up a little bit later, 15 minutes or 30 minutes later, and it's made all the difference in the world. I'm not nearly as grumpy as I was before. I have a much better chance of being loving and patient and kind and gentle, the fruit of the Spirit that Christ wants to show the world around us. And so are you getting enough sleep? If you need an alarm clock to wake you up, or when you get up in the mornings, if you're not energized or refreshed and you struggle for several hours, perhaps you need more sleep. One thing that I always prided myself on was I could drink 20 cups of coffee and still go to sleep. I could drink coffee at 9:30 at night and fall right asleep. And the truth is I would fall right asleep, but it wasn't until I started tracking my sleep that I realized the quality of my sleep was greatly diminished. Once I started tracking the quality of my sleep, I saw that I wasn't getting any deep sleep or REM sleep, which is the recovering stages of sleep. And so I cut back to half caffeine during most of the day, and then I made a cutoff time in the afternoon, and I noticed that greatly increased both my REM and my deep sleep. And so, yes, I was able to sleep, but I wasn't getting quality sleep. And so simple things like cutting back on caffeine or other stimulants or making sure that you turn off the screens an hour before bed can greatly increase the amount of quality sleep that you're able to get. And so consider going to bed a few minutes earlier and waking up a few minutes later, and don't feel guilty about it. It's part of God's refueling process for you. We see Jesus modeling for us all throughout the Gospels, him getting away from the crowds and going to sleep and refueling before he continued on his mission. I do want to quickly say to the few of you who maybe are exhausted and burnt out, and you've tried healthy eating and drinking water and getting enough sleep, and you're still feeling hopeless, and that feeling just isn't going away. Please don't hesitate to get some help. There is nothing spiritual about trying to be superhuman. None of us are superhuman. God doesn't call you to be superhuman. As a result of the fall, our body's chemistry can be out of whack, and if you find that you are to the point where you can no longer function in your responsibilities in life, please go see your doctor. Don't wait, because often the longer you wait, the greater the cost. But for all of us, regardless of where we are with our tanks currently, Jesus tells us the greatest thing that we can do is to love God with all of who we are and to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. That's a tall order. It takes intentionality. It takes training. It takes intentionally arranging our days in a way that will fuel our bodies and feed our souls. And so this week's next step, I want to encourage you all to take some time, and you can do this every day for a week and then look back, or you can just kind of look back at the last couple of weeks and make one list. Make a list of the things that you do or don't do or consume on a typical day that fuel your body. These are the fillers. You can put fillers on one side and then put a line down the middle and put drainers on the other side. And list all the fillers, the food, the water, the exercise, the the sleep or the lack of sleep, the things that fill you up and the things that are currently draining you. Maybe it's a lack of sleep or not getting enough water. Prayerfully pick one change that you're going to implement this week and ask God to give you the strength to make that change. I also want to encourage you to read Ephesians 2:10. Another verse that I would encourage you to read is Romans 12:1 and 2. And these verses will remind us of why taking care of our physical body is an important part of being a Christ follower. In Romans, we're told that in view of God's mercy, in view of everything that God has done for us in and through Jesus Christ, that we are to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. And then in Ephesians, we're told that we are created to do good works. We're created as instruments of God's good works to the community around us. As Ted talked about last week, our bodies were not created to be ornaments, but they're created to be instruments of God's grace. We get to be the hands and feet of Jesus. And so this summer, let God fuel you with good eating habits, by staying hydrated, by getting enough sleep, by moving our bodies, maybe just a little bit more than we currently are. But my prayer is that as you do this, as you fuel your body and feed your soul, that God's Spirit would speak to you in that small, still voice and remind you of who you are, that you've been given every spiritual blessing, that nothing can separate you from God's love, that you are more than a conqueror, and that you are an ambassador, a representative of Jesus to those around you. We get to represent who Jesus is to the world around us. What a great privilege and what a great honor. What a great motivation for us to fuel our physical bodies and feed our souls so that we can be filled up with God's joy and love and peace, that we would overflow in it and be able to offer that to the world around us. What a blessing that would be. Let's pray. God, I thank you. I thank you that you have blessed us with physical bodies. You tell us that our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. God, you call us to be good managers of every blessing that you have given us. And God, sometimes we think about spiritual things as coming to church and reading the Bible and praying, and those are beautiful gifts and ways to connect with you. But God, I pray that we would begin to think or rethink about how our bodies and taking care of them can be an act of worship to you, and how taking care of our bodies well will allow us to be able to love you and to love others even better. And God, as we think about one or two ways that we can make adjustments to our daily schedule to be able to better take care of our bodies, I pray that you would speak to us in a small, still voice and remind us of your love for us and remind us of your great purpose for us. And as we arrange our days in a way that would allow us to better take care of ourselves, I pray that we would take great joy in knowing that we have the great honor of representing you to the world around us. May we do it well. In Jesus' name.